Okay, so I want to welcome everyone to week 2 of xEssentials. Tonight, we're very honored to have one of the xLights developers with us, Scott Hansen of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Right, Scott?
Yep.
He's going to be doing a introduction to xLights. So, Scott, you've got the floor.
Okay, well, thank you for joining me. I'm just going to hopefully go over some basics of xLights here, kind of some good practices, I hope, to give some people some direction on how to start if you're brand new to it. And I'm going to cover some things that are coming in xLights here, hopefully in the next month or so, that are actually not released yet. So we'll go over some of those new things. So I just have a basic outline. I'm going to talk about some basics of xLights, some things that are kind of good to know, the show folder, kind of location, structure, and then the 3 basic tabs of xLights, the setup, layout, and sequence tab. So some basics that are good to know is your show folder is kind of your key location. That's where xLights stores everything from sequences to your layout to media files, your audio. So it's kind of a important directory to know where it is at all times. A lot of people like to put it in their user directory, so like my documents. So it's good to know and remember that's kind of that's all your files. So try to back it up as much as possible, and you should. That's kind of the critical thing. So with xLights, it's not channel based like with lore or some of the other sequencers. It's model based. So everything in xLights is based on the model. So when you sequence, the effects are mapped to the model. Um, in xLights, it's kind of critical to first build your model. Is what we call them xLights, or your props, basically in xLights first. You want to when you build them in xLights, that'll make it. It's there's xLights only supports certain wiring orders and stuff, so you need to do it in xLights so then you can actually build it physically. Because with like a mega tree, we need to know the start location, we need to know the wiring direction if it's up and down, and this will make it a lot easier if you build it in xLights first and then physically build it to later. If not, sometimes you have to do custom models, which is a lot harder to deal with. So it's always better to build your models in xLights first. Um, in xLights, the models are kind of the important things for names. xLights bases all the sequencing on the model name and the group models names. It's not channel based like in lore or other sequencers. So whenever you add an effect, it's tied to the model name. So in the future, if you change model names, you would have to then change all your sequences and update like how the effects are mapped to the names. So model names are kind of critical to do that first. The XML files are the most important. So your sequences are XML files, and then there's other XML files for other data. The FSCQ files are not as critical; those can always be regenerated from the XML files, but you cannot go backwards. You cannot create an XML file from an FSCQ file. So the big thing that in the last couple of years in xLights that we're trying to do to make it easier for newer users is we want xLights to do all the controller configuration. So if you're using a supported controller, like a Falcon, an FPP based one like a Culp board, a SAN device, a PixLite or PixCon, J1Sys, AlphaPix, an ESP Pixel Stick, or a HixPix, all those can be configured from xLights. So in my opinion, it's a lot better to let xLights do all the start channels, and then it will just push the configuration to the controllers. And then you as the user, you don't have to really worry about start channels, universes, and all that kind of stuff. xLights will just handle it all for you, and it's kind of it. You don't have to worry about anything. The only thing that kind of there's some caveats that the auto channeling mode doesn't work, and that's if you have large props that span multiple controllers. You still have to do those manually, and there are some scenarios where if you put a star in the middle of a string, it sometimes is not good for like a mega tree. And you do weird things like that, it won't work correctly. So that's why it's always good to do your modeling in xLights first, and then do the wiring afterwards. So first, I want to talk about show folders. This is kind of like the critical. How you lay this out is kind of important to how xLights is. A lot of people will just do a flat structure where they'll just have a show folder with all their files in it. But I personally like to do subfolders in my show folder. So I just want to kind of show my basic show folder. It's probably a little complicated for some, but in here you have your RGB effects and your networks and your key bindings. These are files that determine how things are set up in the networks tab or in the setup tab and the layout tab. So they're pretty crucial. And then I just have subfolders for different things. So I put all my audio files in an audio. Some of these are auto created, like the backups and the color curves. Those are created by xLights. Same with the downloaded faces. Those are when you download a face in xLights, it makes a folder. But then I also make an import directory where I put in all of purchase sequences or anything from a vendor or from the Google Drive. I put in there. So then it's not polluting my directory here. And then I save all my mappings for my imports into a mapping. I have a media, which is kind of pictures and videos, custom models that I've made as models. And then I actually make a sequence folder per year. So instead of doing a new show folder every year, I just keep iterating this one because I never really go back. But then I do my sequences per year. So then when it comes to this year, I go to an old folder and I know how I have to upgrade the sequence and where I have to remap stuff. So this is kind of how the way I would do it. And another thing, when you're doing like your show folder, I'll just start an empty show folder. It's critical if you are going to do the year that you keep the file path, the last file name. This is kind of like the seed of when xLights does searching and stuff. This is the seed of where it goes back to when it does the search. So you don't want to change this name ever. So like I just always call mine lights. And then if you want to change it year to year, it's better to put it in a subfolder called like 2020. You can change the folders under it, but you always want to keep the topmost folder just called lights. So, or you can call it, my lights. That's kind of just my naming culture, but you can do whatever you would like. So there's kind of a new feature that Keith has been working on a lot, and I've been helping as well, where we're going to rewrite. He's made a couple videos about it, but we're redoing the setup tab. So historically, it was very channel centered, where you would have multiple lines with all your outputs listed in channel order. Where now we want to go to this more controller centric idea, where every line in the setup tab or controller tab would be one controller. And then from here, this allows you to do the uploads a lot easier, and you can configure settings on each controller. And it also makes it easier to switch protocols. So if you want to go from E131 to DDP, that can be done a lot more dynamically and a lot easier. So I'll show a demo of that here in a second. So as part of that, there's kind of a dialog now that shows all your settings, and it makes it a little bit faster to change the settings instead of having to click on multiple dialogues. So I'm going to fire up the newer. I currently have a build of the newest version of xLights. So first thing it does is ask for a show folder. So I'm going to go to that show folder I created on my D drive. It's called 220 lights. And right now, that just opens up a clean version of xLights. So this is the new controller tab. We pared it down. There's a lot less buttons, but the concept is there's only 3 real types of controllers. There's USB, which is like the serial devices, DMX, Renard, Lord dongles, Ethernet based, which would be DDP, E131, ArtNet, ZCPP, or the standard just null, which is kind of nothing. So if you wanted to add a new controller, you would just do add Ethernet. It would populate it with a default name, and you could put whatever name you would want here. You could put just as your F16 V3, maybe your left house. And that's the name. You could do a more description if you wanted to say exactly where it was, but I normally leave that pretty blank. And then down, there's just the active. That's similar to how it was before to show if the controller is active or not. And then there's an option for vendor. So this would be the vendor of the controller. So if you're using a Falcon, you could select Falcon. And then there would be another option for model. So I have a F-16 V3. There is a version which is currently not really used, so you can just leave that blank for now. And then the red kind of highlights that you need to put in an IP address. So the IP address of my Falcon is 192.168.1.205. And protocol, then you can select if you want to do E131, ZCPP, ArtNet, and DDP there. And the standard proxy, start universe, I'll just keep it 1. Like number of universes, just do 20 for now. And then there's some additional options. So by default, it just sets all of them to the same size, so 510, or you could do an individual size and change the sizes dynamically if you wanted to, but I personally just keep them all the same. So that's kind of the new, this is just the generalization. And then if you wanted more devices, you could add other Ethernet. So if I had a second controller, let's say I have another controller plugged in, which is one of my Pocket Beagle 16s. I'll call it a Pocket Beagle 16, and it's under the culp, and it's a Pocket Beagle 16. The IP address is 192.168.1.8, and we could change the protocol to DDP. We'll put the size at like 20,000, just so we have a lot of channels. And if you also notice, so once we selected all these settings, down here are some buttons where we can visualize, which is the same as the visualize before. We can upload our inputs and outputs. That's the controller upload. That feature's been there in the right-click menu. Now it's more prevalent. And then we can open the web page. We can remove it. And then there's also a green dot. And this basically represents if we can ping the controller. So if this controller is online, this will illuminate green. So both of these are currently plugged in. And if I open the web page, it shows that I have my Falcon currently plugged in, and that's why it's green right now. So this is kind of the general layout of the new, and hopefully this will be coming soon to the newer releases in the next coming months. So after you do the setup tab, which is kind of actually optional, you don't have to do it in theory. The next major tab is the model tab. So the whole point of this is to specify your layout of your house. So you can import a picture of your house, and then you would lay your props on your house. So this is just my layout. I have all my props on there. And then, so the big question I get with layout is, do you want to do 2D versus 3D? Starting last year, we integrated 3D support. But for a lot of people, I think 2D is still good enough. I personally still use 2D. 2D is a lot simpler to use for new users. It's a lot easier to do. When you go to 3D, there's a lot more dealing with the handles, and adjusting the models can be a lot more complicated. So sometimes 2D is just better. If you have just a very flat front of your house, I would just use 2D. But if you do have a corner lot, or you have a very large display, 3D can give you some unique render styles and make it so you can render from the top or render from the side. And you can do more cool effects with like the piece stakes and some of that more advanced stuff. So I would just recommend, if you're starting out, to just start out in the 2D mode. If you run into where you need to do more advanced things, then you can always switch to 3D. So in the models tab, the whole idea of it is you define your models. So this is like a mega tree. I set it up as 180 degrees. There are 100 nodes per strand, and this kind of just shows you all your settings. And from there, depending on like your wiring location and your number of strings, you can then see like your wiring. And this is kind of the aspect of, first you want to wire everything in xLights first. So this custom model was made in xLights, and then you can see the wiring. So now when I go to populate this is a chroma flake from Boscoyo. You want to follow the xLights wiring diagram, And then when you physically put the effects on the lights, it should map exactly and you shouldn't run into any issues. So the final major tab is kind of the sequencer tab. This is basically where you do your sequencing. It's the intent of it is to be like a video editor where you would play the song over time, and then you would drop effects on your models. So, like I said before, the effects are tied to the model names. Um, you can create sequences with or without music. Timing tracks, those are kind of critical. There's lots of videos out there about that. They can be generated automatically with the Vamp plugins, or you can manually create them. And then there's things about render order. They're set on a per sequence, and it's set by the master view. We'll go into a little bit more detail about that. So sorry, I want to demo some of that stuff. So in the layout tab, if you're just starting out here, you would just make your models however you would like to do it. So if I want to make a mega tree, you first want to select the tree, and then when you click and drag, you want to start in the top left and drag to the right. So you select that, click and drag. That's always kind of the key. If you drag the other way, you'll get some weird upside down tree sometimes. So it's always good to go the top left to the right. And as I said before, you kind of want to do your wiring in xLights first, but you can always change these settings later. So if for right now you just want to build a mega tree, you're not for sure what the final design is going to be, you can just come in here and say it's going to be a 180-degree tree if that's what you would like. And you can just keep this at the default 16 to 50. And then maybe in the future, you build a 32 by 100. You could change that later and just re-render. Because since the effects are tied to the tree name or to the name of the model, I could just call this mega tree. As long as I never change that, my effects will always be tied to that model. So, and as kind of specified with the new controller view, for start channels, you can always do the old method, which is still supported and still, if people want to use it, you can do an absolute style, which is what's kind of the default in here. Or you could set up the universes, and you could select that this is on universe 1 of the controller. But kind of the way I do everything now, and I really recommend people go to this way unless they, I don't see any reason not to at this point. But you can actually select the controller as we specified earlier, and we just specify the controller name, and then we set what output it's on. So if we just want to port one of our controller, we want to put this mega tree, we would just say it's on the F16, it's port 1, hit save, and if you look correctly, this is a 16 string by 50. Up in the top here, it'll show it's using controller connection 1 through 16. Some things that are also kind of crucial is you have to set the protocol. By default, it does WS2811, which is a pixel protocol. So this will put it on the pixel ports of the controller if you select. So the default's a pixel protocol, but if you wanted to add something to a DMX port, you would then, like if you had a single line and you had dumb RGB nodes, you could change the string properties here, and we'll just say we have a 3-channel RGB, which would be dumb nodes. And then you would put this as, like on a Falcon, if you wanted to drive it off the second DMX port, you'd put 2, and then change the protocol to DMX. So now this would be on the DMX port, so it'd be the first channel. So if you keep the DMX channel to 1, it would be on the first channel of the DMX port. So if you had like a dumb controller that did dumb RGB, you just plug that into the second DMX port, the second jack on the Falcon, and when we upload from xLights, it would automatically configure that. But similarly as well, we would want to change this to, the controller that it's using. So that's kind of the standard. There's tons of models here. So I'll go over some of them. I know it's very popular to get like a prop from Boscoyo, and that's where there's this download model. And if you click the download button here, then you have to click and drag out just like with the tree, left to right, draw the box where you want the model, but then you can select any of like the Boscoyo models that are built in. So if you purchased a snowflake from Boscoyo, you should be able to just select it in here. Say we have like a 3-prong, and then you click Insert Model, and this should match whatever model you bought at from Boscoyo. And then if you want to see the wiring of it, you could just do Wiring View, and this would show you how Boscoyo basically recommends wiring it, how they have done their nodes, and then this is what xLights will use. So that's why you want to kind of match this. So there is some more. If you also go in here and do like node layout, this will kind of show you how you have it wired and set up in xLights. So on the mega tree here, I did the node layout of the tree, and we set it up as a 16 by 50. So you'll see that it's string 1, node 1 is at the bottom here. So since we're bottom left, it's basically doing the wiring of the bottom left here, node 1, string 1, and it goes up. And then the second string, node 1, and it goes up as well. So if you wanted to change the wiring to be bottom right, like you planned on plugging it over here, you would just change this to bottom right. And then when we go back to the node layout, you would see that this is string 1, node 1 over here now, the bottom right. And similarly, we can do the wiring view as well. It's a little bit harder to see on these denser props, but you can kind of see that this is the rear view. This is the back side of it, so it's a little different. But you can almost see that node 1, 1 is over here. Then there's 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1. It kind of gets buried because of the angle. So that's why sometimes the node view is that way. So the node dialog also kind of gives you some aspects of how the rendering is done. I don't know if I have some more videos explain this a little bit more detail, but when you actually are rendering effects on certain items, this is how it generates the buffer. So if you ever put like a bars effect on here, it would be generated on this as like a 2D grid. So if you ever, when you ever start getting to more advanced sequencing, this is kind of a way you can kind of visualize in your mind how the render buffer is going to be generated for this model. I'm not really looking at the chat. I don't know if there's any questions or.
Yeah, so there's a couple questions. What happens if you change a model name after you put effects on it?
So basically the next time you would open a sequence, it would ask you, do you want to map the effects from an unknown model to a new model? So you would have, there's a button to remap them. It'll pop up when you open the sequence. That's why it's kind of good to standardize your model names at first. If you're going to do a bunch of arches, do arches like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then you don't have to go back. If you ever want to rename them, you don't have to worry about it as much and go through and update all your sequences.
So then this one says, so I have all my models built and xLights has determined start channels. Example, my arches start at the end of a railing and railing starts at end of a matrix. But is it impractical to wire it that way? And what's the easiest way to rearrange that after all the models are built?
Yeah,
a little more complex problem, but
yeah. So the default in xLights is it just chains everything together. So you don't have to, you don't have to wire them that way by default. That's kind of just the default. Once you get a controller added, you can go in here kind of how I did here. So if I wanted my like right now I have my mega tree on outputs 1 through 16 on my Falcon. If I wanted this snowflake on 1 instead, I could just change this to 1 and then change my mega tree to start at 2. And assuming I have an expansion on there, so I have 32 outputs, the auto start channel will rearrange these props for you. So you got to first select the controller. I keep forgetting to do that. But so if you actually look in xLights, now it'll rearrange the start channels So it's doing the DMX first, just because that's kind of the best way to do it. But then it'll now chain, the snowflake is on channel 4 through 147, and then 148 is where the mega tree is. And that was based on the controller connections. So since I put this as port 1, I put that first, and now the tree is port 2 through 17, so it gets second. So it'll auto arrange if you use the auto start channel mode by just selecting the controller and the output. It'll automatically update those start channel chaining for you. And if you wanted to, like say I want to put a star on the top of this and I want this to be off channel, I want this to be after the tree, you could just put this on your controller, put it on 17, and it should automatically just chain it after the tree. But let's say I have multiple snowflakes, so I'll just Control C, Control V. So I have 2 snowflakes here, and I want this one to be on port 1, but I also want this to be on port 1. As you can see, it's red right now because it's kind of impossible for both of them to be the beginning of it. So you can set this by the model chaining to be after, and then in xLights, it'll actually, this will be the first one on your port 1, and this will be the second one on your port 1. And you can go back to the controller tab here, and we can actually visualize this and see what it's doing. So on my F16, we can hit the visualize button, and it'll actually show us how it thinks you want the models. So it has our 2 flakes. They're named basically the same, so it's hard to tell them apart. But it put the first one is, and then the second one on the port, so it chains them together. And similarly with our tree here, it put all the 16 on the ports 2 through 17, and then on the 17th port, it put the strip, and then it put the star at the end of it. And also that single line that we set up as a DMX is on here. These are the DMX ports. So xLights will kind of show you all of that so you can visualize how you're going to set up your controller, and you can also just print this or save this as well. So like I personally went through all these, saved them as CSV, and then when I was setting up in my yard, I knew how everything was kind of plugged in. So
there was a question on Facebook as to how many channels makes a universe.
So by default, xLights assumes 510 channels for universe. You can do up to 512. That's what the DMX standard does. So I would just, 510 is kind of easily divisible by 3. So you can do 170 pixels. So then you're not accidentally chopping off pixels, doing 2 channels on one universe and 1 on the other. So 510 is kind of the standard that I would just leave this set to. So like once you have your layout done, the next tab that you would do is sequencing. So I'm just going to do a quick, I only put, well, we got like 4 or 5 models there. So well, let's actually add a group. So if we wanted to group our 2 snowflakes together here, we can just right click drag on them, and then we can do a create group, and we can make a group just called learn how to spell snowflakes. And then if we wanted to, we could do a whole, we could just do this as whole house. And since I clicked and dragged and selected them all, that made a group. But if you added a prop later and you would like to add it, you can just highlight that group, and then this dialog will appear. And let's say I wanted to add my star, I could just do the over. You can also just double click and it'll go back and forth. So you can click and drag or use the arrow keys to put stuff in your group. So there are some settings in the group about how the rendering is done. Most people just leave it at minimal grid and leave it at 400. There some of these options, this is kind of advanced to go over here, but minimal grid just basically means when you're doing doing effects, it'll make a grid around the elements, and that's how it will render the effects. So the models will be put in a grid, and it tries to do a 400 by 400 would be the max size of the grid if it had to, but for only 2, it'll just try to make boxes and put them all in there. So that's kind of the default. I would just leave it at that unless you have a reason, of a reason to change it. I would just kind of leave it as the default. So let's just do a basic sequence. So the first thing, I hit the new sequence button here, or you can do File, New Sequence. And your first choice is a musical sequence, which would be audio, or an animation, which would be with no audio, like I was going over before. So we'll just do a basic animation. Frames per second, there's a lot of debate which is better. I personally in my show run 40 frames per second, but a lot of people 20 frames is more than adequate. So we'll just select 20. You can hit quick start, there's some more options for doing import, but I personally would just hit done here. And it brings up the sequencer. So by default in xLights, the render order is the master view here. So why this is important is if I put an effect on the top layer here, and then I put an effect under it, it actually will override. Like right now, the whole house is overriding the snowflakes. So the render order is from the top down, basically. So whatever effect is on the top will be rendered. And then if there's an effect under it, on the element or on the model here, it'll override that. So you'll never see these bars if you have a butterfly here. So why this is critical and why this is kind of important is you can edit this in your quote unquote master view for this sequence. So if we do edit display elements, it'll bring up a dialog that shows you kind of your master view render order for this sequence. So by default, what I would like to normally do is most people when they sequence, they want to have their larger groups on the top. So when you put a whole house effect on, it'll be on all your models. But then if you do specific sequencing, like on a tree, it'll then override since the lower elements always override the higher ones. So there's some sort options to make this. And there's one I added called by name, by group, at the top by size. It's super confusing name, but basically it puts the elements in order by group size. So larger groups, which would normally be like your whole house, will be at the top. And then groups with less models, like the snowflakes group, or if you have a group just with two matrices, those will then be lower. So if we do this option, it'll put the whole house on the top, then it'll put the snowflakes below. So then when I'm sequencing, this will, if I do a whole house effect, that'll go on everything unless I override it with maybe something on my snowflakes or on my mega tree, then those will get overridden since they're lower in the render order.
What determines size, Scott? Is it the number of pixels or the number of props?
Size relative to what?
When it's sorting by size.
So it's the number of props in the group. So once it gets to the models themselves, it's kind of just alphabetical at that point. But the groups, that's what's kind of more critical, I think, for the sorting is you want your whole house. That's why originally there was just put the groups at the top, but then I would always have to go through and put my whole house at the very top. So then I added some logic to do the by size. So now the groups will be by size. So now in theory, if we re-render this, when we select it now, the whole house has the butterfly, but the snowflakes actually has just the bars on it. So the lower models effects are overriding the upper. So in some of them, some demos, actually people put a group at the bottom called override everything, and I can actually do that. We just make another one called let's just call this override. And we'll put everything in it again. And then in our sequencer, if we wanted to add that new prop or new model, we can go to that display elements again. And now things that are not currently in this sequence will be in the left list, and you can just hit the over and it'll put it in the right list, which is, this is everything in your render order for your master view. So I added that override, and we can put that at the bottom. And then similarly, if we ever wanted to do something like we have a big fade on an on effect or something, we always want that to be over everything. We could put an on effect and then do a start intensity of 0 or something. And at the bottom here, this will basically override everything. So it's kind of a trick if you want to fade everything to a certain color or something at the end of a sequence. So that's always an option. There are some settings that are kind of critical for sequencing. In the newest version of xLights, this is currently in the released version, Dan added a new settings dialog. So it used to be historically between the import and the help, there was a setting and there was a giant long list. But in .4, Dan actually moved it all now. So in the file menu, there's the preferences, which are basically all the settings for xLights, and then these are the sequence settings specific. So these are the same sequence settings that were here before. So for an animation, by default, it's a 30-second. So if you wanted to make this like 2 minutes or a minute, you can always change this. And then if you wanted to come back later and change your like, this is the 20 frames per second. So it would be 50 milliseconds. If you wanted to be a 25 milliseconds or 40 frames, this is where you could change this if you wanted to change that later. And then there's just some things in here, like if you had a song, you can put in some metadata, and then timing tracks. So timing tracks is kind of the next important thing here. So when I'm dropping effects right now, they're kind of just dropping randomly. You can actually add a timing track. So if you want to manually put in timing marks on a timing track, by default, there's always new timing. It's just the standard blank one. So you can actually just play this by hitting the space bar, and then you can hit the T key on your keyboard, and it'll add timing marks. So, you know, if you were listening to a song and you wanted to distribute at different points of the song, like when a certain something rises or falls, you would put in these just manually. Or if you have the Vamp plugins installed, you can do the add timing mark. And because of how I'm currently running this, I don't have them installed, but there would be more options where you could actually add them using, I'll show that maybe here in a second. But the whole point of timing marks is once you have a timing track selected, now when I drop an effect, it'll go between those timing marks. So this gives you, if you wanted a part of your song where you had this effect, this gives you a way to kind of align the effects to the timing marks. And then these can also be used if you're using like the VU meter or something like that. There's some options for timing marks as well. So that's kind of the basics of sequencing.
How would you create a preset from an effect that you dropped or a series of effects?
Okay, so by default right now, I just have all these as one layer. You can always insert multiple layers. So let's say on my whole house, I want to do, we'll add 5 layers here. So now we'll have 6 total. And the layer render order is actually backwards of the model render order. So the lower layers actually get rendered first. So if we were to put multiple
or random effects,
yeah. So yeah, so if you want to be a pro sequencer like me, I love to just generate random effects and then hope they look good. So by default, last year at some point, historically when you did random effects, which you can right click and then do generate random effects, it'll just generate a whole bunch of random effects. You can hit play and you get whatever randomness. But as you could tell, there are some that are kind of unuseful, not very. So last year at some point, I don't remember when, I actually added a setting for this now. So if you go to the new settings and go to random effects, you can actually select which effects you want to be generated. So like the music effect was generated, I think. That's not something I really care about. And you can actually go through and then say which ones you cared. So if If I only wanted a bunch of bars effects or butterflies, let's just, fan's pretty cool. Garland. We'll keep pinwheel. And these settings are stored to your computer. So every time, this is not per sequence, this is actually per instance of xLights to your computer. So now that I selected what I wanted, I can just hit OK. And let's just, if you unselect the timing mark, you can then just do a click and drag. Like you can select everything and kind of blow them out. And then when you select the timing mark again. So if you wanted to do what Ed wanted here, we can do generate a random effects. And now it'll only generate the ones that I had selected in that settings dialog. So I get lots of bars, pinwheels, and butterfly effects. And then from here, we can generate a preset. So if we wanted all these to be a preset, we can select them all, right click, and go to the effects preset. And in the effects preset, this is kind of a tree dialog, they call it. And you can have groups. So like if I want to say, I want to add a group and I want to say, these are my mega tree presets, even though these are whole house. So let's call these whole house. Should create something. So it'll basically make what we call a group, which would be a subheading for preset. And then we could select new preset and we could call this my cool preset. And as you can see here, it made a preset. And there's some kind of specific data here that's trying to help you a little. So 6, this is actually the number of layers. So we have a 6-layer preset, so it shows 6. And then this is the timing, so how long the preset is. So let's say we click off of this and we want to open the presets dialog again. If we click this and do apply, it'll add it right there, and it'll do the 6 layers, and it keeps the exact same size. So that's why you need to do the timing. So this is a way, and if I wanted to add another group, like I wanted to say these are my snowflake presets. Wow. I need to learn how to type. You can also, I guess it makes, forgot about that. It does, so I have a group now of a group. If you want to do the high level group again, you need to click the top one. And then you could put, these are my other cool presets. And it'll make another higher level group. So it's a way you can organize them. And you can also export them and import them. These are all stored in your RGB effects file. So as soon as you add a preset, it'll actually, in your layout tab, this button, the save button, will go red again. So you need to save it in here to save the presets to your RGB effects file. And then those will also appear in another sequence. So you can have those multiple. They can be reused multiple times. They're kind of shared. They're stored in your show folder. So.
Okay. Thank you, Scott, very much. I genuinely appreciate on short notice you stepped up to plate, and I really appreciate it. So thanks.